From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. A production of iHeartRadio.
Hello, welcome back to the show. My name is Matt. Our colleague Noel is on an adventure, but will be returning shortly.
They call me Ben. We're joined, as always, with our super producer, Andrew Triforce Howard. Most importantly, you are you. You are here. That makes this the stuff they don't want you to know. We are recording this on Monday, May 12th, year of our Lord, 2025, which means here in the U.S., yesterday was Mother's Day. If you are able to chat with your mom or contact her, please do so. And we're sure that your mom will say, you don't have to call on a specific day. She's just happy to hear from you. I'm starting on a positive note, Matt, for this one especially.
Yeah, yeah. Had a great Mother's Day over here. Bunch of mothers in bunch of different types of mothers, right? Different stages of life over here in this sector of stuff they don't want you to know. I don't know how to.
Yeah, that works.
Whatever.
Yeah. Anyway, if you can, you should. And we are, with that positive note, talking about something that has worried the heck out of civilization since the close of World War II, and rightly terrified people at times. Some of us in the crowd may be old enough to remember things like the Cuban Missile Crisis. You may have, if you're a history buff, read about any number of near misses in a launch of global catastrophes. We have been scared as a civilization for the better part of a century now by the possibility of a full-scale, what we call a hot or kinetic war, involving two or more nuclear capable actors. And Matt, I believe you and I are of a generation that still grew up under the shadow of the potential catastrophe between the USSR and the USA. Did you ever have to do any of those nuclear drills?
No, I never got any of the nuke drills, but we definitely got the fear talked into us about it. I mean, once you learn about a nuclear weapon and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and you learn about all the testing and all that stuff, and I remember in school that was hammered home. Mm-hmm. It was a big deal, but also I think it's a little bit nerfed on purpose in the American education system.
It is now. I remember fully the like catch-22 surreal nature of those drills, where they would tell people to get under their desk in case of a nuclear attack, which was just, I think even kids saw that was ineffective. The best it could do is maybe shield you from some collapsing buildings, but better than nothing, which seems to be the argument everybody makes. One of
the big reasons for that is because of the light blast that could occur depending on how far away you are from the initial explosion. Right. Because it's the small amount of increase in PSI that causes would just burst all the windows. So actually being under the desk would probably be a lot safer than not being there.
Sure. Again, better than nothing, right? But still, it's better than nothing, not a global nuclear war. And now, to your point about nerfing, now the situation seems to have evolved. Humanity is worried about 1,000 things. The nuclear war situation, or the conversation around it, now it looks better in some ways and much more dangerous in others. So tonight we're asking, what happens if everything goes wrong? If one day the geopolitical brakes don't work and the car flies over the cliff, what does a nuclear war actually look like? Hopefully we get through this episode before we find out in person. So we're going to pause for a word from our sponsors. Here are the facts. All right, Matt, we've talked about this in previous episodes. I re-listened to our Dead Hand episode, by the way, which holds up in a very frightening sense. But I think it's safe to say There are thankfully, at this point, only two real-world examples of high-level wartime nuclear detonation in all of history: the U.S. bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah, that's correct. Two bombs dropped from one country onto another. The first one was August 6th, 1945. That was over Hiroshima.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's one of those things we refer to as a chunky boy in maybe it was Strange News. An American B-29 bomber is the first one. This explosion, we'll get into the mechanics of these explosions later, it immediately killed an estimated 80,000 people, the majority of whom were innocents, civilians. That's only the beginning. 3 days later, a second B-29, a second chunky boy, drops another bomb, this time on Nagasaki. This kills an estimated 40,000 people. And when we say 80,000 and 40,000, fellow conspiracy realists, keep in mind, we're talking about the immediate pop, the immediate deaths. Tens of thousands more people will die in both regions as a consequence of what we could call, total weapons and total war, radiation poisoning, the related destruction, flying glass, crashing buildings, and then, of course, the lack of medical care, clean water, and food, which leads to, proliferation of dysentery, disease. People are dying slow and agonizing deaths from burns. You can and should, have you the chance, visit places like the Hiroshima Peace Memorial and the Peace Museum. You can get a firsthand look at artifacts and consequences of this. It is a harrowing piece of history, which means it is a piece of history that all nations need to remember.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Another thing to remember is that when the U.S. deployed those B-29s, they deployed multiple for both of those, what they would call missions, so that several different pilots and groups of people in planes actually dropped bombs, but only one of them within the group actually dropped the nuke. And that way, nobody really knew who actually caused all of that destruction and mass death.
Yeah, similar in a macro sense to what we used to do with firing squads, right? Where you would have 5 or 6 soldiers shooting for an execution, and only one would have a live bullet. The idea that you could give people some sort of psychological sop, right, or reassurance. Maybe it was not me. Because otherwise, how will you deal with the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people on your conscience?
I mean, just one other thing to think about specifically with an A-bomb, an H-bomb, a nuclear weapon of any kind, that you maybe in your mind think of the explosion, and you can see the images that we've seen over the years of what these look like. One thing that it kind of slips my mind, maybe because it is so horrifying, but just the number of fires that get started afterwards, like after that initial explosion, then the amount of fire that occurs on a much larger radius that consumes so many other people, especially depending on the time of, day or night that it's dropped and all that other stuff, and how much warning and
wind conditions, relative industrial infrastructure, petroleum fields, things like that, forest coverage. Yeah, this is something that the Hiroshima Museum, I visited, I won't monologue about it, but this is something that they spend a lot of time on there, in addition to the human costs, the environmental costs, things that simply cannot be mitigated, cannot be repaired, right? This is a hard stop to a lot of what we would consider natural life and natural environmental processes on the planet. And you could consider, war analysts would consider these operations in Japan in World War II a military success, in success being defined by the fact that the ruler, Emperor Hirohito, did surrender unconditionally as a result of these attacks and honestly the larger failing efforts of Japan during the war. But it was also inarguably a humanitarian disaster. This was a Pyrrhic victory for the world overall. And if you visit either site today, again, please do if you have the chance, you'll see that a chill still hangs in the air. This is almost a century ago now, and the areas are physically safe for humans. I can confirm that firsthand, but each city still bears the scars of those horrific acts. You can see the melted rubble of buildings. And this series of attacks, also provides historians, world leaders, and scholars and scientists with crucial data on what could happen in the modern day if these weapons or things like them are unleashed in other regions in larger quantities. As a result, we see the emergence of two incredibly different philosophies, each a reaction to the same inescapable truths.
And when we're thinking about the devastation that was wrought above Hiroshima with that weapon, that atomic bomb, that bomb was known as Little Boy, and it was only a 15 kiloton bomb, which, only 15 kilotons. Basically, that's the amount of tons of TNT, essentially, that it is equal to, theoretically. So 15,000, basically.
And it did not reach near its full capability as well. The technology was still very much in its early days. And the other one, Fat Man, had similar results in Nagasaki. It was Fat Man and Little Boy, I believe, were the code names.
Yeah, Fat Man was Nagasaki, and it was only 20 kilotons. But just this concept of all of these other defensive forces, especially on the U.S. side, calculating, well, how much more devastation would we cause? And if we increased the kilotonnage, by 2 or something like that. And then we'll talk about, as we move towards the future, towards now, how much these weapons have grown in lethality, kilotonnage specifically, to megatons even.
Agreed. The attacks also provided historians, world leaders, scholars, and scientists with crucial data on what might happen were these weapons unleashed in other regions or, troublingly, in larger quantities. So as a result, we witnessed the emergence of two vastly different philosophies. They're drawing very different conclusions and directives from the same set of now escapable truths. One school of thought, which we would loosely call non-proliferation, argues a spectrum of solutions. One, that no new nukes should be created. No new nations should acquire nuclear power. That there must be a robust enforceable framework against building any more of these potential world enders. And on the far end of that spectrum, the non-proliferation spectrum, you see some groups arguing that all existing nukes should be dismantled as well. So every nuclear nation then becomes Frodo, right? They're in Mount Doom, and you're trying to talk them into throwing the ring into the fire. Spoiler, it does not work.
Yeah, that ring has some real, I don't know, what would you call it? Pull?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just this concept, if the ring is in fact the power that comes with having deployable nukes just in your back pocket there.
Right, and Tolkien was not writing about nuclear power, actually, in Lord of the Rings. He found it irritating when people said so we want to bust that myth on his behalf posthumously.
But it also works perfectly.
It works perfectly is the thing, JRR. So the other philosophy, again, drawing from the exact same set of data and objective observations, they go in a very different direction, and they argue any nation currently in possession of nukes must logically fight their damnedest to keep them, especially after the lessons of Libya, right? Or failing that, if you are a nation with the capability to acquire this power, then you need to do so immediately. And this is where we see things like the nuclear arms race of the Cold War, or, of course, the philosophy of MAD, mutual assured destruction. And here I want to pause to give a shout out to our old pal, good friend of the show, Josh Clark, who wrote an article for How Stuff Works that holds up regarding MAD. So just look up that article and you can get the quick skinny on this. The concept is counterintuitively, the more nations that have nuclear weapons, the more valuable nukes become as a deterrent instead of a gun you actually fire. So similar to the old, standoff in Wild West fiction or film, if everybody has a gun and we're all in the same room, we're all pointing at each other, then the likelihood of anyone firing drops drastically. That is, for a time, that theory seemed to hold true, especially because multiple other nations posseed up. Like NATO, Article 5 is probably the most famous example. You attack one of our guys, and the whole gang jumps into the fray.
Well, yeah, the game changes from who has nukes to who has the most outdated early detection system, who has the best early detection system for a launch, right? And does anybody's glitch out all the time or send the wrong information? Because imagine that room where everybody's got a gun, right? And nobody's firing because everybody's got a gun. What if there's somebody who has a hearing aid that malfunctions and they think somebody shot, so they fire?
Mm-hmm. And there have been a lot of close calls, right? Some immortalized in film and fiction, but definitely based on real world events. We also know that once the first bullet in this comparison fires, other bullets inevitably follow in the standoff. It's no longer a standoff now. It's a race to get rid of all your bullets, right? And so, in other words, this scenario, were to continue, results in a world where the winner or the winners, defined by whichever nations are left standing amid the rubble, what they're ruling over is little more than ashes and poison. And we know this is a possibility. This is not just a madcap thought experiment. Since the development of nuclear weaponry and its later proliferation, there have been well over 2,000 documented nuclear explosions. And the spooky thing about it is we don't know for sure how many have actually been exploded, right? The majority have been tests. Right now, the estimation is something like 2,624. But then does it count things like the Vela incident? Does it count things that occurred somehow without observation, especially in the early days out in the stands of the USSR? Some of these were held in secret, but then if you look at the cases like the DPRK, these tests are loudly broadcast to send a message to the world. So it's weird because we have to tell you hat in hand that it is difficult to know exactly how many detonations occurred. It is actually a matter of debate as we record in 2025, but we do know with each detonation, civilization learned more about the possibilities on the horizon, which means that no matter what they said to their domestic population in power structures across the planet, military leaders privately and at times publicly agreed, look, nuclear bombs present terrifying possibilities. These warheads can end the world. But the most terrifying possibility is that our nation might not have access to some of these capabilities, right? We know that guns exist. We know that other people have guns. What can we do to protect ourselves? And there's a logic to that. It's a brutal logic, but it makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we'll fast forward to May 12th, 2025. As we're recording this episode, the situation has changed. And Matt, I think it's fair to say there have been attempts at stepping down the global nuclear arsenal, but for people who want it eliminated, that's still not enough. We know that there have been various agreements, especially between the Russian Federation and the United States, to decommission and to disassemble some of their warheads. But at the same time, more nations acquired this ability, right? China, France, the UK, Pakistan, India, Israel, and North Korea, plus Russia and the US. Those are what we call the Big Nine. And if you got these guys to all put aside their disagreements and count together how many warheads that is in total, the global tally is something like 12,331, which just for a soft note for those of us playing along at home, yes, that is more than enough to end civilization as we know it several times over, according to current scientific estimates.
Yeah, it's weird to look at the little map from the Federation of American Scientists. Looking at the U.S. having around 3,700 and Russia having around 4,300. And but then I don't know. Lately, maybe just with the news, maybe simply because they are engaged in a current hot conflict that is in a quote ceasefire. The 170 nukes that Pakistan holds and the 180 that India holds. It's given me pause.
Yeah. And also, on my end, it gives me pause, even when, when I was studying this professionally, it gives me pause that the numbers are always caveated with around and estimated. Maybe. It factors in, yes, secrecy and a bunch of other things that they don't want enemy nations to know, but that also those caveats also come as a result of not knowing maintenance regimen for a lot of this armament, specifically Russian, but other countries as well, because these are not like the old rotisserie made for TV rotisserie chicken commercials where you quote set it and forget it. You have to keep checking in on these things because they're finicky. Anyway, point being, with all this, proponents of MAD and other philosophies believe that they will tell you this results in a fragile stability. Critics of proliferation say, look, 2025, the present, the current now, is too different from the past for those old assumptions to remain serviceable. So what about, for instance, non-state actors acquiring nuclear weaponry, terrorists, separatists, religious extremists with a dirty bomb and an axe to grind? What if one of those near misses that we alluded to earlier actually does go wrong? What if it's no longer a near miss? What happens then? Luckily, the world hasn't found out yet, but we're going to pause for a word from our sponsors and dive in. Here's where it gets crazy. Okay, Matt, we'll talk about some of the, I think, specific game theory and regional hotspots in a moment, but I think we can both agree a nuclear war, as we've defined it now, would result in things going extremely wrong extremely quickly.
Oh, yeah, definitely. We've got a couple of different scenarios that have been written about recently and explored thoroughly pretty recently in 2019 and then again last year in 2024. So we can shout out Annie Jacobson for her book, Nuclear War, A Scenario, that goes through pretty much what we're about to take you through. It's what happens if the world is at war. Not just a NATO country versus, let's say, Russia, where it's just happening in one part of Europe and Asia over there. It's the entire world is launching nukes, right? That's what we're going to talk about first. Full-scale war.
Yeah. Let's get to that. Let's also shout out Nuclear Choices for the 21st Century, A Citizen's Guide. That's written by Richard Wolfson. We need to shout out the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist because they do great work here, hosting as well the Doomsday Clock, which we've talked about in the past. Shout out to our pal Jack O'Brien.
And definitely Princeton Science and Global Security and Alex Glazer in particular, because there's a thing on YouTube you can watch that is basically what we're going to be walking through here of what happens when the nukes launch, where do they launch, and then what are the casualties. It's fun.
And we'll also introduce, just in the case of fairness and objectivity here, some scientific disputes by various people who are questioning some of these calculations. But anyhow, let's go anecdotal first, and we'll shout out more sources along the way. The harsh reality is that the days of World War II are long past, which means that people have been working on this technology pretty much around the clock since that time, since the discovery. So the capabilities of 2025 are streets ahead, as community would say, of what was available in the 1940s, again, the better part of a century ago. I would add it's also important to recognize that population centers have shifted. Now, unlike in the 1940s, most people live in large metro areas, cities, conurbations. That means that there are more targets in one place. There are also more bombs to hit those targets. And further, there are more efficient ways of moving those bombs across the planet from point A to point Z. And now we've got these posse contracts. I'll just loosely call them. We don't call them that in the ivory tower, but several of the big nine have, almost all the big nine have hard limits and constraints about how these things could hypothetically be deployed. Several of them have something we call no first use policy, arguing that even in most regional conflicts or times of high tension, they're not going to be the first guys to launch a warhead. Their nukes, therefore, launch only as a counterattack or a response, a retaliation measure. But other countries, like Pakistan, don't bother to make such vows. And then yet other countries like Israel are reluctant to openly admit to any nuclear capability in the first place, which is a lot like a teenager coming home, being very high and pretending they just like snacks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're talking about like Israel. But, officially on the books in all of these places, anywhere that's talking about nuclear weapons nowadays, including the Federation of American Scientists, points out that Israel has at least 90 nukes.
Yeah. And for their credit, Israel has never denied it. They've just never confirmed it. And that's part of the strategy there, right?
Yeah. Well, and how many of those are tactical nuclear weapons that would register as a nuclear weapon, but not in the same way as some of the older detection, let's say, technologies across the world could even probably see? It's interesting. It's interesting that it's all going down. It's all, it's all stuff. And, we're talking about capabilities still here in past World War II and if bombs dropped now and when they would drop. An important thing to take into account is in most like gamed out scenarios of nuclear war, it's almost all military targets, at least in the first few salvos.
In the first waves. Yeah, the first two waves are military targets.
And that could just be hours. We're talking hours between when the military targets get taken out, then the city centers could get taken out.
Right. It's
which
much
is just
shorter than a conventional war.
Yeah, it's much shorter. But it is just, I guess it's, in my mind, there's this thing called Plan A you can look up, and that's by that Alex Glazer person, a bunch of other folks, where they actually use that nuke map site that you can go to, and you can basically drop specific kiloton weapons on different places around the globe, and you can map out where the nuclear fallout goes and how many casualties roughly because of the populations. As they go through there, they built a scenario they called Plan A in 2019, which basically shows all of those military targets happening. If it started in Europe, basically with NATO versus Russia, then expanded out to NATO calling in the US to launch their ICBMs, to then Russia launching their ICBMs. And it's all based on detection, right? It's not based on nukes dropping. It's based on somebody got an alert that a nuke got launched.
Detection of launch, not detection of detonation. Yeah, and that's an important point. We also want to shout out Alex Wellerstein, who I believe is the author, or one of the maps I was using, nuclearsecrecy.com. That map, that's a pretty great one too. Terrifying, by which I mean great. This is the thing, right? We're talking about we and many other people much brighter than us have gamed out what they see as the potential call and response, right? The chain of action that occurs. And inevitably, in most scenarios, other people jump into the fray. NATO Article 5, that's a great example. These countries are bound to back each other up depending on a type of conflict that occurs. And in backing each other up and joining that conflict conversation, the entire situation escalates. And this leads to the concern about what we could call regional hotspots, which I suggest we get to in a moment. But first, maybe we talk about this. What happens on the ground? The first warhead launches and successfully detonates. That's the real what happens. And I suggest we stay pretty general because, as we know, a wealth of factors and variables affect the aftermath. The key two variables here are going to be who attacks whom and where those attacks occur. The most immediate effect of a nuclear explosion lasts under a second. It's an intense burst of nuclear radiation, mostly gamma rays and neutrons. Our friends, thanks to our friends at MIT for confirming a lot of this. But the thing is, even though that lasts under a second, it travels. The direct radiation extends nearly a mile from, say, a 10 kiloton explosion, and it's lethal. This, weirdly enough, frighteningly enough, this is not that significant. Other lethal effects come into play at even greater distances. But if you're right there, if you have that tragic, heartbreaking front seat to this, you'll see an exploding nuclear weapon instantly vaporizes. And for a time, it generates a gas, or it becomes a gas that is hotter than the core of the sun. And this hot gas has its own energy. X-rays, they heat the surrounding air. This creates, as we alluded to earlier, a fireball that forms and quickly grows. If you take a 1 megaton explosion, after 10 seconds, you have a fireball a mile in diameter. And if you are 50 miles away, this still looks brighter than the sun.
And just a reminder, we're talking about 1 megaton, which is like the big version, right? Mm-hmm. The first ICBM that China deployed was the Dongfeng 4, and that was 3.3 megatons. And if you go into just the current arsenals that many other countries have, including, the U.S., the old Minutemen warheads, those were a full megaton. Mm. And the old Soviet missiles, the ones that were involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis, those were 2.42 megatons. So these are big old bombs, and they get a lot bigger than that too.
Mm-hmm. And most dangerous, potentially, have never been detonated. Important note, folks, when Matt's saying deployed, that means move somewhere, put into maybe activation, the possible use thereof. Deploy is not detonation, but deploy is a huge signal, right? And it's a signal that can be very difficult to walk back. We know that along with this fireball, there comes a lot of heat. This is something called a thermal flash. And the thermal flash has a lot of consequences far after detonation. It ignites fires. From far away as 20 miles, it can cause severe, even fatal burns. So 20 miles away. For instance, as we learned in the museum, 2/3 of people who somehow survived Hiroshima did so with extensive, severe burns. You can look at plenty of documentation about this. We suggest that you have a strong stomach, should you choose to do so. Then after that, of course, there's the blast wave, there's the ground wave. The blast wave is something we talked about briefly off air, but I know we both researched this extensively. It goes down to PSI, pressure per square inch. The blast wave moves outward, thousands of miles per hour. It slows as it spreads, naturally, but it carries with it about half of a bomb's explosive energy, regardless of the yield size of the bomb. It's responsible for most of the physical destruction you see. And people can actually, this is odd, people can actually, under some circumstances, deal with a deteriorating blast wave, but they are very vulnerable to collapsing buildings, to pieces of glass that become, a rainstorm of knives, essentially. The force of this wave can be such that glass, which is a breakable thing, right? You can break stone with glass, but the glass is flying at such a high speed that it can embed itself into stone structures. Human flesh stands no chance against this. Also, the force can slam you through the air into walls. If you're close enough to a nuclear blast, your shadow can be burned into the material behind you. So that happens. That all happens very, very quickly, right?
Yeah. Yes. And the way an attack would function, if it was on any scale, there would be dozens, if not hundreds, of these types of explosions happening almost simultaneously across the world.
Mm-hmm. And things get extraordinarily complicated if they start happening in areas close together, right? Mm-hmm. So let's go to the midterm. Let's talk fallout. Fallout defined on two levels. First, the actual radiation, and then second, I would argue the geopolitical fallout as a result of that first detonation. So the most heavily analyzed scenario, time after time, has been Russia and the U.S. attacking one another because of the relatively U.S.-centric analysis at play. That's the easiest stuff for Westerners to access. The assumption is always that Russia attacks first, because it makes us look like the good guys in these scenarios. So let's say Russia attacks the U.S. first. Then, because NATO members, UK and France, also have their own nuclear weapons, they are bound by NATO's Article 5 to defend the United States. So Russia, being well aware of this, logically hits UK and France as well, to the best of its abilities with any military targets that they feel might be capable of launching nuclear weapons. The add-on possibility here, the bonus points, would be to attack those places in such a way that uses their own weapons against them, that also detonates the nuclear material on site. Double whammy.
Yep.
Hasn't happened yet. But by this point, to your earlier note there, Matt, it's well known that by the time Russia is doing this, within a very short period of hours, probably, retaliation has already occurred. The U.S. and allies, assuming they retain any capability, which, spoiler, they will, they strike back. So Moscow, St. Petersburg, several military sites leveled. No stone upon a stone. And the dystopian theory would argue that this continues until someone is surrendering or incapable of continuing. In our standoff analogy, you fire the bullets until your clip clicks dry. So if Moscow is wiped immediately, we might finally see the dead hand activate, which is just insane. I still wonder if it could actually work. And I want to pause because that's just a personal hobby horse of mine. But Matt, do you think the dead hand still functions? Do you think it ever did function?
I think yes, but I think there are still humans at the wheel with the dead hand. They're just in strategic places where they won't get touched, like in certain military facilities. Sure. I don't think it's a system where nukes just fire automatically, but there are. Again, we go back to the detection systems. In that plan A that I was looking at, it starts with one tactical nuke being launched by Russia, basically onto Ukraine or into a NATO-controlled area, and then NATO retaliates with one of theirs, like a small singular tactical nuclear weapon, which is much smaller, right? It's meant to take out a facility or something like that.
So-called bunker buster.
Yeah, exactly. But in that scenario, the only thing that messes up is the early detection systems that are aging out in Russia. So the system believes that it is a much larger salvo, so that it does activate basically the early warning system that says, hey, we're being attacked. We need to hit the military sites now before ours get taken out.
And check out our episode on the dead hand, which busts some of the more extremist myths about it, but does give you a sense of how this would work. Essentially, it's a line of continual check-ins with these various facilities to power structures of the Russian government. And if those power structures don't have the right communication protocol, then there's another series of checks and balances. And if that also goes falloop, then a satellite is launched, or excuse me, a missile is launched that communicates with other remaining nuclear facilities or nuclear launch sites, such that then they would begin to launch on their own pre-programmed paths.
Yeah. And there is a thing that we need to talk about that I just have to find here. It's something that Annie Jacobsen talks about in her book, something that every single leader who is in charge of that decision of whether or not to launch a nuke, generally a president or somebody high up in an executive branch in any country, this concept of jamming that occurs in those moments, because we're talking about moments, not, the person in charge has a week to mull over the consequences of whether or not we unleash these ungodly weapons because we've had them launched at us. You were talking minutes, literally minutes, where you were going to have basically everyone in your ear that is of sufficient rank from the military trying to tell you what you need to do. And then you, generally as either a civilian leader, if it's a democratic ruled country, or like in the US, or if you're in another country where you've got more of an autocratic thing, you still have to make that decision so quickly based on the best intelligence you have, based on the sensors that your country has deployed.
And based on further your awareness of enemy force capability and distribution, which is why nuclear capable subs are such a crown jewel for the US and Western navies. So let's assume things continue to go wrong, with each detonation increasingly desperate and ruthless and happening within a short period of time. We see the same consequences, and those consequences can become magnified and exacerbated depending upon how closely various detonations occur, right? So for instance, if Washington gets hit and then New York City also gets hit, then the areas between DC and New York City encounter a much higher degree of consequence and horrific aftermath. And this applies not just to those regions, but to the number of detonations across the globe. This is where we enter the concept of nuclear winter. Long story short, if hundreds of nuclear explosions occur in a short enough span of time, civilization can encounter a new realm of environmental devastation called nuclear winter. Now, nuclear winter has not occurred at this point. Scientists still argue about it, but one of the best comparisons we could have would be how gargantuan volcanic eruption events can darken the sky, right? That is a thing that we know can happen. Concerns about nuclear winter, they hit the forefront in the 1970s, but get this, fellow conspiracy realists, the Boffins knew about the damaging effects of light, heat, blast, radiation, and smoke caused by nuclear explosions. They knew about it for decades, and world leaders sort of ignored it. They didn't really talk about it, even though they knew well before the 1970s.
Yeah, they did. Well, yeah, because they figured out with some of the first nuclear testing what occurs. When an atom bomb, a nuclear weapon, an H-bomb, whatever it is, when it explodes, we talked about that giant sun, essentially, hotter than the sun fireball that it creates. When that explosion occurs, especially if there's like a city underneath where that fireball is and all of that combustible stuff, including the concrete, starts to vaporize and carbonize, basically turn into just carbon floating through the air, it creates this huge, we've seen the mushroom clouds, we know what that looks like, but that mushroom cloud, as it's forced up from all the heat below it, it goes up past the rain clouds, past the tropopause, where the rain clouds form, like the biggest rain clouds, and you get what's called a pyrocumulonimbus cloud that is above all the other clouds. And that crap, once it's up there, for each explosion, it sticks around for years. Not days, not months, years, potentially up to a decade. It sticks up there. And it is a black, dark cloud that covers up even the clouds below it, right? And the cities below it, and the agriculture below it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We also need to talk about the stratosphere. The stratosphere is home to a layer of what we call ozone. Ozone is running interference for life on Earth by shielding everyone from the harmful ultraviolet radiation of the sun. The ozone can be depleted by the large amount of nitrogen oxide produced by the nuclear explosions. To the studies about large amounts of dust and soot and smoke, yes, they can potentially block sunlight from reaching Earth's surface. This leads to a temporary cooling of the air. It's exacerbated by the vast swaths of smoke and pollutants coming from the forests that will burn. Then the plastics, the oil fields, the petroleum stores. The best study for this, or I would say the most prominent, is the TTAPS study from 1983. It's named after its four authors, R.P. Turco, O.P. Toon, T.P. Ackerman, J.B. Pollock, and Carl Sagan. At least one of those guys is very well known to the public. And the idea of nuclear winter hinges not so much on the emission of radiation from the initial blast. It's the fireballs, the smoke, the soot, the dust. They drift at high altitudes, and they ride strong, established west to east winds. If this happens between, say, the Russia and the US, then this knock-on consequence can form a uniform belt of particles that circle the northern hemisphere, like a big girdle or corset from 30 to 60 degrees latitude. These clouds block out almost all of the light from the sun. And initially, their study said this could be several weeks, but even if it's just several weeks, the consequences are immediate. Surface temperatures plummet. Most importantly, plant photosynthesis halts because the plants can't eat anymore. This kills a huge portion of vegetation, animal life, including human animals, and this occurs in step with the existing damage to all human infrastructure. So even if nuclear winter just happened without nuclear attacks, we'd be in a tight spot. But for it to occur after all, like medical, rescue, communication infrastructure has just rolled craps, then the situation becomes very dire indeed. We're talking about a massive and sudden drop in human population. The immediate radiation could largely be a thing of the past. Now we're talking about starvation, exposure, disease, and of course, crime as people become increasingly desperate.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to differentiate the two sets of cloud cover that can occur, because you are absolutely right. You're talking about there's different amounts of smoke and types of smoke that are going to be generated. And as you're talking about the knock-on effects like forest fires, those kinds of things, petroleum burning, anything that's just almost what I would call a normal insane fire happening on Earth, that is going to do those things where it lasts, a couple of weeks as those clouds kind of circulate around the Earth. But the really scary one that causes the winter, at least from what my understanding from a couple of sources, is that it's the stuff that goes above the clouds. So imagine another layer of clouds up near that more ozone layer that you're talking, not quite that high up in altitude, but near there. That's the thing that actually blankets everything it's not subject to the same system of rainfall and then clouds forming again, and then all that particulate matter just falling back to the earth pretty rapidly. That's the stuff that can last for decades, that's how you get, in some scenarios, 2 billion people starving quickly, because the agricultural ability of humanity is halved. That's it. That's the basic scenario for if the U.S. goes to war with Russia right now. you half the amount of food that humans can produce.
And that would be due in no small part to the geographic breadbasket locations, the interior of the United States and Ukraine.
Yeah, but and also, but the good thing is, if you're in parts of Australia and Argentina, you're going to be good to go, because almost none of that stuff is going to affect you in the southern hemisphere that far south.
Depending, again, on the nature of the conflict. And you can check out a great video by our pals at In a Nutshell for a quick explainer on that. We also need to note, again, it's important to acknowledge scientists still dispute the exact calculations involved with those earlier studies. Thankfully, this dispute can occur because a nuclear winter has yet to occur. Again, thankfully. Speaking of things that have yet to occur, we're going to take a break for a word from our sponsors. And then, what do you think? We'll dive into some of those regional hotspots. Okay, all of the things we've mentioned so far. And by the way, in that earlier conversation, both of those forms of messing with the air are very bad. There's not one that's better than the other. They're still terrible for people on the ground. This is why people are paying so much attention to what we call regional hotspots. These are areas of local conflict that in the pre-nuclear days could still have sown chaos now, right? Like Franz Ferdinand. That was a non-nuclear conflict. But these regional hotspots now, more than ever, hold the potential for creating this existential threat. Nuclear exchange with global consequences, spelling doom for billions of people, half a world away. When we talk about regional hotspots, it seems like three of the most prominent are going to be Russia, Eastern Europe, India and Pakistan, and of course, the Middle East.
Yeah, definitely. And India and Pakistan is top of mind because there's currently a truce of some sort. There's a ceasefire, but that was not the case just several days ago. There was serious hot conflict happening with India and Pakistan because of the Kashmir region. That is, we talked about that in the line of actual control, and the different groups that say, hey, this is ours, or this is partly mine, and I get to have the military force and control this area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as everyone watching the news is aware, India and Pakistan, who have been beefed up since more or less at each other's throats since 1947, are reaching a new level of tension. They're both nuclear states. They're extremely hostile toward one another, and they are right next to another nuclear capable power, China. So almost all of the time, they have had different propagandistic, saber-rattling events, right? We see this often in the form of missile test. These tests have recently escalated into actual non-nuclear missile launches against military sites in both countries. Something that concerned a lot of people here in the United States or in the global West was when the current Vice President, J.D. Vance, speaking about this rising conflict, said it was, quote, none of our business. And just apolitically, this left nuclear scholars baffled because, the logic being a nuclear exchange between these two densely populated countries will have effects on the rest of the world. Definitely on the rest of the region. So it's kind of everybody's business.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
This also brings us to something you mentioned earlier, limited nuclear war scenarios, right? Tactical nukes. Even if there's a limited scenario and everybody else refuses to get involved to a greater degree, to a global degree, then India and Pakistan can still use like 100 strategic weapons to attack military and urban centers, which means very quickly fatalities can reach 50 to 125 million people. Again, just like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the vast majority of these people are innocents. They are civilians. They're just trying to live their lives. That's why, interestingly enough, maybe this is almost inspiring. Everyone outside the region, every other nation, has sort of put aside their concerns and disagreements to argue for restraint. Even, China and Russia and the US are unified on this. And those are three countries that do not like each other. It's
Well, yeah,
not
because it would the effects would be roughly nuclear autumn, right? What we
Right.
described there was nuclear winter. This would be bad, and a lot of places wouldn't be able to produce food anymore, at least in the same way that they produce them now. A lot would have to change in order to make food production happen in those areas. But, it would only cause a couple 100 million people to starve, he said sarcastically.
And, also, while we're continuing with, I guess, cold comfort news, it's not that either country, Pakistan or India, has officially declared they're going to launch nukes. It's that at any time, either country could. And there's a lot of SIGINT and analysis going into location and movement, right? And a lot of very frantic conversations on both sides. We know millions would die as a result. And then we go to something that is probably a little more familiar to a lot of people in the quote unquote global West. Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine began in 2014 in earnest, continues as we record. In recent months, in multiple news sources, up to and including just a few days ago, in fact, Russian President Vladimir Putin has made these repeated, at times cryptic statements about the possibility of deploying and detonating nukes in the conflict. So we said we're recording on May 12th. As of May 4th, like literally last week, Vladimir Putin stated the need to use nukes in Ukraine has not yet arisen, and he, get this, hopes it will not. That is a world away from saying Russia will not attack in this manner.
That seems insane.
Yeah.
I just don't understand. Because you can't, Ben, can you imagine a scenario where Russian forces, for one reason or another, decide to launch a large ton, like a several megaton nuke in that conflict? I can't imagine that being a good strategic decision.
It's not rational.
Yeah, maybe that's it.
Yeah, that's the axiom of all game theory, and arguably that can be a weakness when we're talking about, theocracies or people with nothing to lose. I mean, look, current game theory informs Putin's statements from everything we can tell. Yet Western analysts remain skeptical, especially because of that "I hope we don't have to do it" caveat, which is frightening. Russian conventional military is in dire straits, and we don't mean they're playing backup for the band. They've got hard supply manpower issues. Multiple operations are disastrous. Their access to consumables like ammo and electronics have conspired to render this invasion a quagmire. It seems like achieving the original Russian conditions for success is increasingly a pipe dream, but those same conditions make it almost impossible to fully withdraw. It's as though Russia shot a barbed arrow into the West, and now that arrow, like it or not, is stuck in the flesh. It's hard to pull it out. So the way you could win, logically, is by changing the rule of the game. And this goes to what you were talking about earlier. The prime axiom of game theory always assumes a rational actor. Any rational actor in charge of Russia would conclude, similar to what we just did, that deploying nukes is a no-win situation. Population and industrial centers in Russia would be certainly hit within days or even hours afterward. So the concern in the West, the reason we're mentioning this on air, it's still whispered now, but it's increasingly prevalent. What if Putin is somehow no longer a rational actor? What if all those rumors about his health for the last few years are true? What if he feels, for one reason or another, that he's gone too far into the water to return to the shore of logic? You know what I mean? What if it's all about legacy? What if he has, this is speculation that I heard off book, and so we don't want to give too much credence to it, but what if he has a terminal diagnosis of some sort? How does that affect his decision?
What if the people that oppose him are equally irrational?
Right. Yes, exactly. And that goes to the idea of irrationality. Yeah, that takes us, of course, to the Middle East, I think we have to spend a little bit of time on the current crown jewel of potential nuclear disaster. The Middle East, or if we want to be more accurate, we could call it West Asia. Only Israel currently possesses nuclear power in the region. Sorry, guys, everybody knows. But various other countries desperately want this power. And we talked about the lesson of Libya, but we didn't say what that was. Libya stepped back its efforts to become a nuclear power. And for people like the Kim dynasty in North Korea, that's a parable. That is a warning. They see the death of Gaddafi and the toppling of that regime as a more or less direct consequence of complying with demands to become a non-nuclear power. And
he agreed in 2003 to disarm, right? And then that was a long process. And he wasn't taken out until 2011, something like that.
Right. So, and I'm on record saying I think that was more closely affiliated with him messing with the money.
I'm glad you're on record for that, Ben. But yeah, I don't know what killed him, but it's definitely one of those things where if you as a country give up that power, what is to stop anyone with conventional weapons to come in there and who's more powerful to take over?
Yeah, back to our Old West scenario. That's why it's relatively rare in a standoff that's why everybody says, put the gun down. And people almost never do that. You know what I mean? Unless there's a hostage. But
instead they say, pick up the gun.
You put the gun down. But yeah, so because of what, and again, to be clear, I'm giving the perspective of people and nation states pursuing nuclear power. Given the lessons of Libya from their perspective, it's almost certain that none of these countries in the area would ever step back from nuclear status once they attained it. And if we're talking perspectives here, the chief concern of Israel is Iran. Iran is a powerful regional theocracy, and despite its public statements, it seems pretty set on acquiring nuclear technology. Now, the official statement of Iran is usually we're acquiring peaceful nuclear technology, right? Not nuclear weaponry. But we've talked about the development and enrichment process. It's basically the same thing. The difference is the matter of iterations kind of in your centrifuges.
Everybody is developing peaceful nuclear power.
Yeah. And, just like we have the Department of Defense. I almost went Chicago, like defense.
And our Department of Energy is, heavily involved in nukes.
In a very peaceful way, you guys.
So peaceful.
So peaceful AF, which again, I'm still startled that people thought that AF stood as foretold. Peaceful as foretold. So much, this concern is so big that Israel has repeatedly floated the idea of a preemptive nuclear strike on facilities before Iran acquires the bomb. And this
or just kill all the scientists, right?
Right, or implant Stuxnet. Yeah, there have been many non-nuclear operations to prevent this capability. So the idea of launching a nuke, even like a tactical one, is still, for some parts of Israel's government, it's still very much on the table, or I should say their military structure. So even supporters of that plan, if you talk to them, they will honestly acknowledge, a preemptive attack would be pretty chaotic. It would trigger instability. There'd be hard conflict across the region, right? It would exacerbate pre-existing tensions and lead to inevitable attacks on the nation of Israel. But the argument amid the supporters is that not attacking, not doing a preemptive nuclear attack will result in something far worse. That's their perspective.
Yeah. I'm thinking more and more about how a nuke would be deployed, because you tell me what you found, Ben, because what I've found is that most of these detection systems, going way back to like Vela, going way back to all of these, they are detecting ICBM launches mostly.
Right.
Like
atmospheric disturbance. Yeah.
Exactly. So with all of the, like, we've been reading about how there are so many different rockets being sent up to deploy satellites right now across the world. Humanity is just flinging thousands of these smaller scale satellites to float around the globe for a while. It does feel like if a country decided to deploy a nuke old school style, like with a bomber, where you just drop it out of the sky, that's not going to be detected in the same way. You detect the plane, but you wouldn't detect that it's a nuclear weapon falling to the earth until it detonates.
You would need to have the ability to see what kind of payload is on the plane. And there are ways to do that. But yeah, you're right. You don't have a single, no one who's got their vinegar about them, in my opinion, has a single detection strategy, meaning nothing depends on just the one basket of chicken eggs. Instead, you have a lot of SIGINT. You still even have humans, which is not a job, not a job most people want.
Well, we're talking about physically watching where nuclear materials are, where warheads are, and if materials are missing or if a warhead is missing and that kind of thing, and that intelligence gathering on every side, right? And people are just watching each other for all of that stuff. And that's why the dirty bomb scenario was always kind of scary.
Right. The briefcase.
I did a quick look just on that nuke map site, and it's not absolute, right? But it's a pretty good idea when you're looking at that site, just to see the radiuses of different things like the fireball, and then where that PSI change is going to be, where glass shatters. But with a smaller bomb, like a dirty bomb, it is only rated, at least according to that website and some stuff I've just looked up, we're talking tons, not kilotons with a dirty bomb. Theoretically, at least from everything I've found. And if you look at that type of damage, it's still massive, but it is not in any way the same thing as one of these larger, possibly megaton bombs that a major country would drop on another.
Right. And then we also have to consider, I know we're running long here, but we also have to consider the possibility of satellite deployment. Right. Which is a big part of, according to publicly available information, this is not a big part of X-37B's mission.
X-37, boom.
And there's a kicker combo to all of this, which needs to be said. Due to, again, these, what did we call them earlier? Posse contracts held by almost all nuclear nations in some degree or another, it is possible that a single exchange in one of these hotspots we mentioned could trigger exchanges in other, like, non-geographically related regions as well. And once a set of countries goes hot, the others are likewise emboldened to do so. This is not a good guys, bad guys thing at this point. It means that a nuclear launch is dangerous not just because of the immediate physical consequences, but also because it makes it that much easier for everybody else in the standoff to say, oh, I can launch my toys too. You know what I mean? As a matter of fact, I better, because this moves quickly. In actual nuclear war, the period of deployment and detonation, or the period of detonation for sure, would be fairly short in duration. Kind of like how real gunfights almost never last as long as they do in the films, right? It's the consequences that get you. You know what I mean? If you are hearing this, the elephants make war. You are the grass. No matter what you believe, no matter what you agree with, you don't get to take a survey as the bomb is landing, and the bomb doesn't get to decide whether or not you get to survive. Some areas of the world, some small enclaves of people with the ability to prepare, they can soldier on. It's a cold comfort, but it's comfort nonetheless. And it's not a certainty yet, but it is certainly on the horizon. So what do you think, man? I feel like our next episode in this series should be, so we've talked about the facts and the crazy things that could happen. I think a lot of us in the audience right now are wondering, after learning this, well, holy shit, what should I do? How can me and my loved ones survive a nuclear war and all these implications? Does that feel like it's worth a follow-up episode?
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure. One of the things we talked about with Garrett Graff when we had him on a while ago, talked about, like underground bases, bunkers, nuclear war, all that stuff. We talked about the nuclear football. We also talked about the fact that the U.S. president, whoever is acting U.S. president, whether that's the president or the president dies, then, it goes down that chain of command. That single human being is the only person on the planet who can decide if the U.S. launches nukes. And no advisor, no vice president, no senator, no congressman, no anybody can have any say. No general can have any say on whether or not the nukes get launched.
Unless that general, due to massive disaster, is now the top dog. Because the chain of command technically goes all the way down.
Oh, for sure. But that's what I mean. But that guy, that one general then is the person.
And that, it reminds me, I think I shared this story with you guys. I can't remember if it was on air or off air. It's probably off air. But I remember being so impressed with a local politician when I was as a very a younger iteration. And the guy told me exactly how many people had to die for him to automatically become president of the United States. And it was a lot, but he knew the exact number. And I was, in retrospect, I'm still so fascinated by that dude who has long since passed, but I'm a little scared that he knew the exact number.
Yeah, that is scary.
It makes you think about people and their pursuit of power and the dehumanizing effects of that. But,
it's weird that the continuity of government plans are available. Anybody can read them, like the chain of custody and all that other stuff. And
yes,
anybody can read the nuclear deterrence plans that the U.S. has in place. It's just, as Amy Jacobson found, it's something we don't talk about. Like, we just don't talk about it anymore. It's just kind of gone away because we're so far removed from World War II now. The thought of nuclear war, no matter how hot any of these other conflicts get, it's just kind of, we put it away. It's that's not really going to happen, because if it does happen, it's over.
Well, with that in mind, I'm trying to end on some kind of comfort or some kind of good note. I want to shout out the work of Brian Martin, his critique of nuclear extinction, published in the Journal of Peace Research. It may be worth your time to read if you want to see some of the folks who are challenging the dystopian assumptions, or several of those dystopian assumptions at play. We'd also love to hear your personal take on the idea of full-scale nuclear war. We'd love to hear any firsthand experience you have in related fields, and we'd love to hear from you any way you wish to find us. You can find us online on YouTube, Instagram, all the social medias people sip where conspiracy stuff show or some derivation of conspiracy stuff. You can also give us a call on a telephonic device, or as long as an EMP doesn't hit, you can also email us at our good old-fashioned email address.
Oh, our number is 1-833-STDWYTK. It's a voicemail system. Call in, give yourself a nickname, and let us know within the message if we can use your name and message on the air. If you want to send us an email, we are
the entities that read every piece of correspondence we receive. Be well aware, yet unafraid, sometimes the void writes back. Would especially love to have a bit of a book club. Recommend your favorite nuclear disaster works of film or fiction. Thinking things like Canticle for Leibowitz, The Day After Tomorrow. Hey, you hip us to your favorites. Conspiracy at iHeartRadio.com.
Stuff They Don't Want You to Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.